Hello class, I hope everybody is doing well today. We are starting our discussion about the three different branches of government. We're going to get into them in a little bit more detail this week and next. And so I'm going to take a few minutes and go over the legislative branch with you to make sure that you know the basic functions and responsibilities of the legislative branch. And so we covered this a little bit when we did constitutional history. Hopefully you all remember that the legislative branch is the first branch that was created during the Constitutional Convention. If you want to find it in the Constitution, it is Article 1. And it probably was considered to be the most important, not the most powerful, but the most important branch because it's the one that people actually elected their representatives to. Very quickly, please know that the direct election of senators did not start happening until the Progressive Era. So there's a long time where we have people who are in state legislatures, who are elected to state legislatures, choosing who the senators are going to be to Washington, D.C. During the Progressive Era in the early 1900s, though, there was a strong move to try to allow people to directly elect senators. People have been directly electing representatives to the House of Representatives since the beginning, those who were able to vote. But during the Progressive Era, the Senate is brought to the same standard. The idea is that Congress really should be a body that is directly elected by the American people. So there are two different houses in the legislative branch. You have the Senate, which is considered to be the upper house. Senators they serve 6-year terms. In order to run for the Senate, you have to be at least 30 years old. The Senate also is the body that allows for equal representation for all states. So as you can note back here, we have 50 states. Each state has 2 senators. We have 100 people in the United States Senate. Now, the Senate is a body that has very few rules because it's the smaller of the two numerically. So in the Senate, for example, there are certain things you've maybe heard about, like, for example, attempts by senators to prevent legislation from being voted on, something called a filibuster, where they can talk for so long in the hopes that people will give up who support a particular bill. There are some rules on the filibuster, and they've kind of changed over the years, but there are not a lot of rules in the Senate. The Senate is a much more open body. It is a body that has a president, technically. The president of the Senate is the Vice President of the United States. There is a President pro tempore or pro temp, who is typically the person who is like the main officer in charge of the Senate, because as you can guess, the Vice President doesn't get up and go to the Senate every day, not unless he or she's really needed. But the President pro temp is the main leader when the Vice President isn't there. In the Senate, everybody has an equal vote, but that can cause a problem with 100 senators, and no matter how many states we have, we're always going to have an even number. So anytime you have an even number, there's a chance that there could be a tie. So the President of the Senate, the Vice President, is not allowed to actually vote unless there is a tie. So, for example, if you have a president who's put something forth and he or she's really worried that it may not have enough votes, or there could be a tie, that's sometimes a day of voting that you'll find the Vice President of the United States sort of hanging out just in case a tiebreaker is necessary. But in the Senate, whoever's in the majority party has a majority leader, and whoever's in the minority party has a minority leader. And so basically a lot of the things that are taking place in the Senate will be led by either the majority leader or the minority leader, and the hope is that a lot of times they're able to cooperate with each other. Of course, because they come from different parties, oftentimes they have different views, and so it's kind of up to the leadership to find ways to compromise and come up with legislation that does not necessarily infringe upon a minority, but also recognizes that, if a party is elected as the majority, there was a reason for that. In committees, the Senate has a number of committees. Many of them are standing committees. A standing committee is a committee that does not go anywhere. It's always there. So, like, for example, the Senate has an Armed Services Committee. It has a committee that deals with Social Security. And so these are committees that are always there, And these are committees where if you come from the party that has the majority in the Senate, the chair will be on the committees more than likely from that party. That's something that the party leaders really get to decide. So therefore, usually who's ever in the majority has all the chairmanships of each committee. Likewise, though, each committee has a vice chair. That person usually comes from the minority party. And so you can kind of see that even though you have a party that's in the minority in the spirit of the Senate, that doesn't necessarily mean that they should be kind of pushed out completely from the governing process. In contrast to that, the House of Representatives has a lot more members because representatives are reapportioned every 10 years according to a census. We do not add representatives, by the way. We only have 435 representatives. If we added more for the population, the problem with that is we could eventually have a House of Representatives that had thousands of people in it. And, when you're dealing with governing bodies, it's great to represent people and you want people to be represented, but at the same time, too, there has to be considerations where if you have a body made up of, 5,000 people, it's going to be really hard to get a lot done. So every 10 years when you fill out your census data, a large reason why you're doing that is so that we can determine as a country whether we need to redistribute representatives. So if you've had a state, for example, over 10 years that has lost a lot of population, that state might actually lose a representative or maybe more than one. If you have a state that gains a lot in population, that state might actually have a representative added after every 10 years. So it can change and it can shift. For example, right now Arkansas has 4 representatives, and those districts are kind of distributed around the state. Please know that the amount of people that a representative represents is going to vary, because let's just say hypothetically a representative is given for every 1 million people. Well, you may have a representative in a district that is, when a census comes, actually governing and helping 1.9 million people. Well, you wouldn't actually get a new representative unless you hit the million mark again. So you can have a representative who's actually representing, close to double the amount of people that a representative is elsewhere. For example, states like Wyoming and Montana that have lower populations, Constitution says that every state has to have at least one representative. So even if you have a state like Wyoming that may not even have 1 million people, Wyoming still has at least one representative. So you may have a representative in Wyoming that is representing, let's say 800,000 people, and then you may have a representative in New York that's representing, 1.8 million people. And so this is important too, because for those of you familiar with the Electoral College, we add the number of representatives plus senators to determine how many electors a state has. And so that is part of the reason too why some of the smaller populated states actually have a little bit of an advantage in the Electoral College. Anyway, but we'll get to that a little bit more later. Now, it's also important to note that it's in the House of Representatives that there are actually non-voting members. Most of the time, these are people who are referred to as delegates, with the exception of Puerto Rico. But we have areas that the United States has acquired, like the Mariana Islands, Guam, Puerto Rico, that are not technically states. So therefore, they do not have the right to elect senators, and they do not have the right to have voting power in the House of Representatives. But, however, they do have a right to be heard. So these delegates are basically non-voting members, which means that they can serve on committees, they can speak up, they can give speeches, they can do all of that stuff, but they're not allowed to actually vote. For those of you who've been to Washington, D.C., you'll notice some people in Washington, D.C. have license plates that say taxation without representation. That is because the District of Columbia is actually not in a state officially. So the people who actually live in Washington, D.C., they don't technically live in Virginia and they don't technically live in Maryland. Instead, they are their own district. But because they're not a state, they are not able to elect senators and they don't have representatives. Washington, D.C. does have a delegate, though, but as many of the folks in Washington, D.C. will point out, their delegate can't vote, hence taxation without representation. So in the House of Representatives, though, there are a lot of standing committees as well. There are committees like the House Ways and Means Committee that deals with a lot of different issues. There's a Judiciary Committee. These are committees that are basically always around. I do want to mention that sometimes special committees or select committees can be created for a specific purpose. And so, for example, after the 9/11 attacks, we had a 9/11 committee that was known as the 9/11 Commission, but it was made up of committee members from both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, as I mentioned to you in the video about the Constitution, this was sort of James Madison's plan to balance everything out, because the Senate, obviously, smaller populated states still have an advantage in the Senate because they have equal voting power to larger populated states. In the House of Representatives, if you take a state like California today or New York, where there's a very, very dense populations in areas, they obviously have a lot more representatives in the House of Representatives. But the idea is that if legislation has to go through both houses, that it'll be more evenly balanced and that there are protections, therefore, in both houses. So the process was put together extremely well. And by the way, to be a representative, you have to be at least 25 years of age. But hopefully this is kind of giving you a basic rundown of the two different houses and how they function. It's also important to note, too, that sometimes is the case, both houses will come together when voting on legislation, and they'll vote on it at the same time in order to hurry up and get it through. When that happens, sometimes they actually form what's known as a joint committee that has members from both houses on it, so that one bill with the approval of members from both the Senate and the House of Representatives can be sent through both. There are also cases where sometimes the House and the Senate will be working on bills that are related to the same thing, but through the process of getting through each house, the bills are not exactly the same. And so afterwards, what can happen is what's called a conference committee can be called together, where members from both the Senate and the House come together, basically take the two bills and try to compromise and make it into something that both houses can agree upon. One thing to remember about the democratic system is compromise has always been a very key to success. Now, hopefully everybody knows this, but if a bill passes through both houses, which by the way most don't, most bills get proposed. They are sent to committees for research. Those committees sometimes even form subcommittees to do even more extensive research. And if the subcommittee comes back and says, well, it may be a good idea, but after doing our research, it's just not viable, it could be killed at that point. A committee also has to vote to recommend for something to go onto the floor. And so if a committee could actually vote, no, we don't want it to move on. Then, of course, if you're a sponsor of a piece of legislation, you'll have a moment to get up and actually speak on its behalf. If you're in the Senate, you can speak pretty much as long as you want to, with a few restrictions. If you're in the House of Representatives, you'll only be allotted a certain amount of time because there are hundreds of people and there's only so much time. But if it passes through both houses, it goes to the president, and it's ultimately up to the president of the United States to determine whether or not something becomes a law. As the chief executor, that is, one of his main, powers. And so a president can sign a bill into law, and the president also has the choice to veto the bill. And the president also can choose to leave it on his desk for 10 days. And if he doesn't do anything with it over that 10-day period, it does technically become a law. You might ask yourself, why in the world would this happen? Well, there have been cases in U.S. history where a president wasn't really anxious for a piece of legislation, but perhaps maybe knew it was something that was popular among the people. So he may have decided, well, I'll let it become a law, but at the same time, too, I'm not really willing to give it my seal of approval. So I hope this has helped you all understand the legislative branch, or at least it's been a review for some of you who already knew most of this information. As always, if you have any questions or you need my help, please feel free to email me.